Welcome back. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and, let's be honest, incredibly complex topic, the political world of first century Judea. If you've ever found yourself wondering who was actually in charge at the time of Christ, well, you're in exactly the right place. We're about to peel back all those layers of power to see how it all worked.
Okay, so let's start with the central question here. Who really ruled Jerusalem? Now, you might think there's a simple answer to that, but the reality was, well, it was a tangled web of overlapping authorities. It wasn't just one person or one group, but this delicate and pretty often really tense balance of power.
So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll set the scene, this land of many rulers. Then, we'll look at the ultimate authority in the room, Rome. From there, we'll zoom in on the local control under Herod's kingdom, and then the religious rule of the Sanhedrin. And finally, we'll get to the good stuff, what happened when all these different powers started to collide. All right, Section 1, a land of many rulers. Look, it's so important to get this in your head right away. First century Judea wasn't some unified state with a single leader. No way. It was a complicated mashup of Roman imperial power, local puppet kings from Herod's family, and really influential Jewish religious leadership. Each one had its own turf, and their interests, they were often in direct conflict with each other. So, let's start at the absolute top of the food chain, Rome. By 6 CE, Judea had become an official Roman province. And what that means is that the final say on any major political or military decision didn't come from Jerusalem. It came from the Roman Empire. They were the ultimate authority. And the emperor's guy on the ground was called the prefect, or sometimes procurator. This was the Roman governor. And believe me, he held immense power. The most famous one you've probably heard of from this time is, of course, Pontius Pilate. He was the highest civil and military authority in the whole province, and the only person he answered to was back in Rome. So, what did a prefect actually do all day? Well, their job description tells you everything about Rome's main priorities. The prefect's #1 job was to keep the money flowing back to the empire by collecting taxes and to keep the peace. That meant managing public order, squashing any rebellion before it got started, and, this is a huge one, they had the final authority on capital punishment, life and death decisions. Okay, let's move down to the next layer of power, Herod's kingdom. See, while Rome held all the ultimate power, they didn't rule every single region directly. They were pretty pragmatic about it. They often used local client kings to manage the day-to-day business of certain territories. And this is where we see a really key difference. Judea, which is where Jerusalem was a full-on Roman province. It was ruled directly by the prefect. But up north, Galilee was governed as what they called a Herodian tetrarchy. This is a super important distinction. It means the folks in Galilee were living under a totally different local government than the people down in Jerusalem. So what in the world is a tetrarch? Well, the word literally means ruler of a fourth part. After Herod the Great died, Rome took his kingdom, chopped it up, and gave the pieces to his sons with this title. Herod Antipas, for instance, was the Tetrarch of Galilee. He had a lot of freedom in local stuff, building cities, collecting his own local taxes, running his own courts, but he always served at the pleasure of Rome. And that brings us to the third and maybe the most personal layer of power, especially if you lived in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin. This was the absolute heart of Jewish religious and civil life. It was a powerful council that had a huge influence over the daily lives of the people. The Sanhedrin was basically the supreme Jewish court. It was made up of 71 members, a mix of community elders, powerful priests, and expert legal scribes. So while Rome was managing the big picture stuff, the Sanhedrin was the main group handling Jewish self-governance on a local level. And their authority was pretty extensive. They were the ones who interpreted and enforced religious law, which, back then, governed just about every part of daily life. They judged local civil and criminal cases, they managed the internal affairs of Jerusalem, and, this is key, they were often the go-betweens, mediating between the Roman prefect and the Jewish population. And the person leading this whole council? The high priest. Now, in this era, the high priest wasn't just a religious figure. He was, for all intents and purposes, the civil leader of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. In a city that didn't have a mayor like we think of one today, the high priest was the most powerful local leader, period. So let's just put this all together for a second. If you're in Galilee, your primary ruler is Herod Antipas. But if you're in Judea and Jerusalem, it's the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate.
Local government in Galilee is run by Herod's people. In Jerusalem, it's the high priest and the Sanhedrin. Even law enforcement is different. You've got local officials in Galilee versus this mix of Jewish temple guards and the Roman military in Jerusalem. The bottom line here is that where you lived completely determined who ruled you. Okay, so now we get to the really interesting part. What happens when these different layers of power don't just exist next to each other, but actually start to collide? This whole system, with its overlapping jurisdictions and competing goals, was just a recipe for constant friction and conflict. Just think about law enforcement for a minute. There wasn't one police force. You had local judges and elders dealing with civil arguments. You had the temple guards enforcing religious laws inside Jerusalem. And then you had Roman soldiers, whose job was just to keep the peace for the empire. And hovering over all of them was the prefect, who had the final say on any crime he thought was serious enough. What a mess, right? And really, this is the main takeaway. This complex, layered system of government, part Roman, part Herodian, part Jewish, it wasn't just some boring political backdrop. It was the source of the constant tension that defined the entire era. Every single political and religious event from that time was playing out against this backdrop of friction.
So we'll end with this thought. The power structure we've just walked through wasn't just a history lesson. It had real, everyday consequences for the people living under it. And it makes us ask a question that's just as relevant today. When different laws, different cultures, and different authorities are all forced into the same space, and they inevitably clash, who is it that ends up paying the price?